First impressions are important. Don't get too anxious about it. They aren't so important that they override everything else, but in reality and fiction alike, a first impression establishes a vibe that future interactions with that person will be compared to, either to confirm or contradict that initial read as the audience builds up a more nuanced version of them in their heads. Usually, to make sure the audience understands the major parts of the character from the get-go, they'll be introduced into the story by appearing in an establishing moment that illustrates some foundational element of their characterization. A heroic type might turn up saving someone, a villain might spend their intro threatening someone or otherwise displaying a general disregard for morals or well-being, a sneaky character could turn up unannounced somewhere unexpected, a compassionate character might swoop in to help someone in distress, an authority figure often enters the story complaining about loose cannons not following orders, etc., etc. It's pretty simple and clean to the point where I kinda suspect most writers don't consciously think about this too much. It's very easy to introduce a character by just letting them show up doing something very in character for them, and that usually means the first impression the audience gets is just a microcosm of what to expect from the character going forward. But sometimes, rather than a character being introduced through some tellingly revelatory initial appearance, a character's reputation precedes them. Sometimes, the first thing the audience learns about a character before they ever get to see what they're capable of firsthand is how the other characters feel about them. This character has already had a lasting influence on the world and the story, and our first impression is thus shaped by the impression the other characters have already formed. And most commonly, this reputation is one of absolute intimidation, and the characters that softly introduce us to this currently unseen figure do so in hushed, fearful whispers. This is all very good at building up a profoundly intimidating image that casts a shadow on the story a mile long, and the character casting that shadow is commonly known as the Dreaded. In order for a character to qualify as the Dreaded, they can't just be scary or badass, although both of those things are usually true. A Dreaded character is one whose terrifying reputation functionally operates like a horror-coded noodle incident, an off-screen space of vague accomplishments that ensures the characters know to fear them long before the audience learns why. They're capable of things that are horrifying and unbelievable. They've got a powerful reputation, and they've earned it somehow. In order for them to be dreaded, they have to actually inspire dread, which is a slower burn than fear. Fear is a quick, simple feeling, typically rooted in facing something dangerous and unknown. In order to experience dread, an audience has to be given enough information to see the edges of that dangerous unknown, to begin to speculate in detail on its shape and form. The more terror this absent figure inspires in the characters who've dealt with them before, the more worrying they become. And this can be an absolute blast. It's got all the appeal of slow burn suspense with the added headcanon bait of the noodle incident, practically demanding that the audience wonder what sort of extremely cool stuff this character must have done to earn such a daunting reputation, especially among characters who are themselves demonstrably powerful. What kind of character could make even these people tremble? In broad strokes, there are three major categories of the Dreaded. The first one is actually pretty understated. Sometimes a character is introduced seemingly absolutely harmless, soft-spoken, kind, perfectly amiable, physically unintimidating, etc. But for some reason, at least one character finds them profoundly terrifying. They've clearly got some hidden dark side, some skill, some power they aren't currently using that they could theoretically bust out at a moment's notice. And the audience won't find out what that hidden terror is until that moment comes. For these characters, their dreaded status is often a bit of an absurdity right up until we learn why they're so thoroughly feared. Because these characters have always earned their reputation. The punchline doesn't work if they're actually harmless, and some dreaded characters do turn out to be all bark and no bite, all rep with no real pep to back it up, but understated dreaded characters never do. That cute child will turn out to be a reality-warping force of nature. That unassuming goofball or quietly polite person will unleash hitherto never-before-seen violences upon their foes, and that adorable animal will eat parts of you that were never designed to see the light of day. There's overlap between understated dreaded characters and the crouching moron hidden badass archetypes, but the gimmick almost plays in reverse. The reputation of these characters' abilities precedes them, so their harmless facade plays quite differently when the audience is clued in from minute one that the things they're capable of are anything but harmless. There is one specific point of overlap in the Venn diagram, which is the character who seems so completely unlike the terrifying portrait their reputation has painted that people who only know them by reputation actively refuse to believe they've got anything to do with the guy on the wanted poster. This mistake is usually rectified very quickly as soon as they get dragged into an action sequence they can't just bluff their way out of. Understated dreaded characters usually have a reason for maintaining a semblance of general uselessness, whether it's an intentional misdirect to make people underestimate them, or if they genuinely rather not be this terrifying dreaded figure, and sometimes it's nice for them to pretend to be chill. The second category of dreaded character is the sleeping dragon. These are characters whose intimidating properties are very obviously inarguable, but their ability to act in the story starts off very minimal. They have been a huge problem in the past, and they could easily be a huge problem again, but they're currently sleeping, or dead, or imprisoned in crystal, or some other thing that keeps them from doing anything actually harmful. These guys get the chance to earn their reputation the moment they wake up and usually immediately start being an enormous problem. Sleeping dragons are almost always just as dangerous as everyone believes them to be, although in some rarer cases, usually characters based on a certain great sage equal to heaven, the sleeping dragon, while very dangerous, turns out to have a major redeemable streak to them and begins using their terrifyingly OP powers for a protagonisty cause, though the reputation their past misdeeds earned them is likely to follow them around for the bulk of the story. In purely villainous cases, however, it is extremely common for these guys to be accidentally woken up by a main character who knows how bad the situation is about to become, for maximum dread points and self-blaming behavior later on. Sleeping dragons usually need to be dealt with either by figuring out how to kill them or managing to seal them away for someone else to figure out later. Since their presence in the story is usually pretty limited, they're allowed to be extremely overpowered and more than earn their dread reputation in the limited time they spend being an active problem. And the final category is what I like to call the oncoming storm. This is the most overt and active form of the dreaded. They're powerful, they're terrifying, and they're coming this way. Everyone is afraid of them for very good reason, and they aren't exactly subtle about what they're capable of. Tales of their great and terrible deeds haunt the lands. However, this is also the category of dreaded with the greatest chance of not actually having any oomph to back it up. Sometimes stories blow up out of proportion, and like the brave little tailor of old, sometimes the oncoming storm is just a breeze that was in the right place at the right time. In these cases, the character will have a lot of stories about them, possibly stories they perpetuate themselves, possibly stories they've tried desperately to debunk, but regardless of who's spreading those stories, they frame them as an unbelievably powerful figure that only a complete idiot would dare to challenge. And unchallenged, the reputation remains intact. These characters suffer somewhat from having ultimately one joke and only two possible resolutions. Either their reputation remains ironclad and everyone believes they're unbelievably dangerous forever, or the lie is eventually revealed and the whole thing falls apart. A true oncoming storm is a much more nuanced beast. As a character, they struggle with a challenge that neither the understated dreaded or the sleeping dragon needs to contend with. They need to be simultaneously extremely scary to live up to their own off-screen reputation, while also not being so game-breakingly overwhelming that they completely bust the story's power curve. They have to be dangerous, but not unmanageably so. Understated dreadeds and sleeping dragons only need to bust out extremely small, localized bursts of terrifying power to maintain their characterization. If the oncoming storm doesn't live up to their own supposed intimidation factor through their actual on-screen actions, they risk plummeting into the supremely uncool depths of character who brags about all this cool stuff they supposedly did off-screen, but you wouldn't have heard about it because it was at another school in Canada. And even if they are allowed to be on-screen powerful, oncoming storms, like all powerhouse characters, risk suffering from the Worf effect if their hypothetical strength and power is only ever displayed when something even beefier uses them for target practice. So they need a chance to prove their power without being so game-breaking that they just instantly win. And in longer form stories, this is a problem that needs to be solved over and over again to maintain their dreaded reputation without letting them decay. And this is a difficult problem to solve. One really interesting case study for this is Dragon Ball, a story that loves dreaded villains but never cracks the code on keeping them dreaded for long. Even in the really early arcs, almost every villain was introduced reputation first, so someone more worldly than Goku could tell him why this new threat was a serious problem he needed to fire up the brain cell to actively worry about. This format started escalating with the introduction of King Piccolo, the scariest, most brutal villain to date, introduced as a sleeping dragon unsealed at the beginning of the arc to kill a few main characters and wreak havoc. Goku successfully kills him, but he spits out an egg that turns into regular Piccolo, just like King Piccolo but younger and stronger, who gets to be the main villain of one tournament arc before he gets unceremoniously booted into the reluctant protagonist zone by the arrival of the Saiyan saga. Now it's the Saiyans' turn to be the incredibly terrifying dreaded threat, super powerful alien warriors stronger than Goku and worse than anything they'd seen before, with a whole year of in-universe build-up for the surviving protagonists to do their damnedest to prepare, only to fail anyway in the face of the overwhelming might that subjugated 1,000 screaming worlds. And they get to be the main villain of one extremely long fight scene before Vegeta runs away and gets supplanted by Frieza, the incredibly terrifying dreaded threat that's laid whole worlds to ruin and worse than anything they'd seen before, whose overwhelming power quickly forces Vegeta to team up with the good guys and then just kind of never leave. So there's a pattern in this story of villains getting introduced with a lengthy resume of past atrocities grander in scope than any previous antagonist, a whole story arc's worth of building dread at their unbelievable power, culminating in one extremely long fight with Goku and friends where they finally display their fearsome might for all to see, and then a pretty quick turnaround where they either die or get supplanted by a new problem and fast-tracked into the new best friend zone. Every Dragon Ball villain is introduced as a dreaded threat, and they usually get to live up to that within the confines of the arc they're centered in, but the serial power escalation eventually leaves all of them behind. Frieza's probably the best instance of a dreaded villain, with multiple seasons of excellent build-up as the gang slowly climbs through the military hierarchy of mini-bosses to eventually run the marathon of fighting him through 4 separate escalating transformations. But when they brought him back for a big vengeful return, he and his dad got one-shotted by a brand new character. And then when he got brought back again for a big vengeful return part 2, this time it's a movie, he got explicitly dunked on for having been completely left behind by the power scaling. He got one new form and assumed that'd be enough, and that's just not the kind of behavior that got him the reputation of the Scourge of the Galaxy. The specific form of dread that the villains in Dragon Ball inspire is based on the fact that the limits of their powers are unknown. When they're introduced, all that's known about them is that they are incredibly dangerous, and so the initial question is always, oh shit, like more dangerous than our best friend Goku? And then throughout the fight, they'll reveal hidden gimmicks and secret techniques and ultimate transformations and fail-safes, and they won't lose until they're completely out of tricks, which of course means that in the process of seeing all those tricks, the audience learns exactly what they're capable of, and that means the dread goes away. I just think it's a really interesting example of how difficult it is to maintain the balance of intimidation when a character doesn't get bundled off screen as soon as they show off their power. Last season's terrifying shadow on the horizon is this season's final boss is next season's begrudging ally. The primary difference isn't that they get redemption arcs or anything, although that does usually happen eventually. It's just that they stop being terrifying unknowns. The main thing that keeps a dreaded character feeling dreaded is usually moderation. They can't always be busting out their terrifying abilities. If we see them being unbelievably powerful 24/7, they're either going to break way too much stuff, or they're going to force the other characters to figure out how to deal with them and fast, whether that means running away or just putting them down for good. And if the story feels too contrived about finding reasons for them to not participate because they're simply too OP, that can end up feeling like the Worf effect with extra steps. If they never get to show off, they're all bark and no bite. If they're constantly showing off, it loses its gravitas through overexposure. For the understated and sleeping dragon versions, this moderation is accomplished by making the character unwilling or unable to be terrifying 24/7. The understated dreaded usually has a personal reason to show an unassuming side 90% of the time, and will only rarely be stirred into serious action, while the sleeping dragon is usually sleeping or whatever equivalent is keeping them inactive in the plot. For the oncoming storm, a character who has no reason to restrain themselves from proving just how terrifying they really are, something else usually needs to be done to keep them manageable. The simplest option is usually to make them literally physically distant, an approaching threat that doesn't get the chance to overstay its welcome because it's literally slowly approaching for most of the story. On the way, they can show how menacing they are by taking out the people actively trying to stop them, and when they arrive, the final act begins and they get to pay off all that building dread of their slow approach. Physical distance can also be maintained other ways. An overwhelmingly terrifying threat can be mitigated if they don't know where the other characters are, or if the other characters don't know where they are, or both. A character who's unbelievably dangerous in a fight can be stymied just by keeping them away from anyone they can fight, meaning they spend most of their time hiding or seeking and only rarely busting out the moves that earned them their reputation in the first place. A slow game of cat and mouse can also make a dreaded character seem more dangerously intelligent if they're skillfully evading other characters or cunningly narrowing down where they could be hiding. And of course, when they finally do cross paths with the other characters, there's a chance for them to bust out their full potential and absolutely wreck shop. One example I've been really struggling not to overuse in this video comes to us in Transformers Prime, a show I like for a lot of reasons. One of the primary ones being how it characterizes Megatron. When the show starts, Megatron is nowhere to be found, and the Decepticons are instead being run by Starscream. However, his absence is being treated as a temporary calm before the storm, and a lot of the early dialogue is centered on characters wondering where he is, worrying about when he's going to come back, and overall just keeping a watchful weather eye out for him. This is a perfect dreaded introduction. Even if we've never seen a Transformers story before, all we know about this guy is that all of these extremely badass alien robots are really worried about what it'll mean when he comes back. So the next thing the show needs to nail is his actual return, which happens at the end of the first episode. He'll need to pull out some serious heavy ordnance to live up to that terrifying reputation he has. So what's his evil plan? Oh, just using Dark Energon to raise a giant army of Cybertronian zombies, bring an entire planet's worth through a big space portal, and use them to decimate the Earth. In his introduction, that's a really solid start. If this is his opening volley, we can immediately immediately understand why the people who've been fighting him for millions of years would be worried. And then, cleverly enough, the show layers a few different methods of keeping him at a distance to preserve that dreaded vibe through the rest of the show. The main thing is that our heroes have a secret base to hole up in, and almost every confrontation they have with the bad guys is out in the field in controlled bursts of violence, rather than a total war fought on the home front. This uses the physical distance trick to ensure that Megatron gets to be kept on the shelf for special occasions, and his much less dreaded lieutenants get to do the bulk of the episodic dirty work. And as a bonus, after the pilot, he also gets blown up a little bit and ends up on ice for the first half of the season, transforming him handily into a sleeping dragon. Through a combination of these writing strategies, Megatron manages to be continuously characterized as a terrifyingly dangerous force whose appearance is always really bad news, which also pulls a little bit of convenient double duty, since the show makes it abundantly clear that when Megatron is on the field, the only person who can match him hand-to-hand and plan-to-plan is Optimus Prime. By keeping Megatron profoundly terrifying, the story by extension makes Optimus also feel extremely powerful. Structurally, since they purposefully mirror each other, Optimus ends up feeling dreaded in his own right. And I feel like this is a good time to bring up that while it's pretty natural to think of most dreaded characters as villains, there are plenty of heroic or at least protagonistic characters that fit the bill too, inspiring profound terror in their enemies due to a mile-long list of unbelievable accomplishments and skills. The lowest hanging fruit in that category is Batman, who definitely falls into the hide-and-seek category of self-regulation. He's not showing off his crazy kung fu skills and ludicrous overpreparedness 24/7 because he doesn't get chances to do it 24/7. He usually has to do a decent amount of detective work to figure out where and how he needs to punch people, but once he decides somebody needs punching, he'll be there before they even realize he's onto them. What makes him so dreaded is that nobody knows where he is or what he's capable of. And in order to reinforce those principles, stories featuring Batman at his most impressive will usually let him surprise the audience directly, either with, "Oh, I didn't realize he was or wasn't there," or, "Wow, I didn't know he could do that." He's always just a little more competent and a little more prepared than we expected, and that helps us continue to believe that even his longest-running enemies dread having to deal with him. Some dreaded characters can also be trusted to sort of self-regulate their moderation. The plot doesn't need to keep them cut off from their surroundings if they're not interested in causing problems most of the time. A dreaded character is usually in some way so OP that they're disconnected from smaller-scale concerns, which means a lot of them just won't see any reason to bust out the heavy ordnance for anything less than a prophesied confrontation with their one true nemesis or an equivalent. Sometimes a dreaded character is more intimidating because they usually don't do anything to intervene. They're sort of a self-enforced sleeping dragon. Nothing is actually keeping them from being a problem, they're just choosing not to be a problem right now. And that means as soon as they start participating, everyone suddenly has a very good reason to be very worried. These characters usually aren't strictly front and center to the story, since a character who doesn't care to participate in the plot is probably not going to make a very interesting focal point, but they do show up in roles like mysterious drifter allies with unknown personal motives, heroes of other stories who are usually busy dealing with their own problems, and extremely competent mentors with very frightening reputations from their younger days who will very rarely descend from their mountaintop retirement to actually knock heads like they used to back in their prime. On the villainous side of things, you can get this version with commanders who spend most of their day-to-day managing the runnings of the big evil army of doom instead of being boots on the ground themselves. And absolutely nobody wants to make themselves enough of a problem that they have to put down the duty roster and actually get their hands dirty. One factor in managing a dreaded character is the question of how they handle defeat. For a lot of dreaded villains, their first defeat is also their only defeat, and it marks the end of their arc in the story. And that's fine, but for a longer-term villain or a protagonist with a dreaded reputation, that's usually less of an option, which means the writer needs to figure out how they'll handle a loss or a setback and how that'll affect their dread vibes. Sometimes a dreaded character's defeat kind of strips their dread status away from them. The mystique is destroyed, they've had some kind of third-act breakdown that has made them look ridiculous or incompetent or both, and even if they continue to be a problem, they're not inspiring any more fear. From what I've observed, it seems like the main way a dreaded character manages to maintain their dread reputation even after losing is if they continue to inspire that feeling of uncertainty of where exactly their limits lie. Did they lose because they tried their absolute hardest and it wasn't good enough because they're just too underpowered to compete, or did they lose because they needed an edge they didn't have and now they're motivated to find or create that edge no matter the cost? A character who suffers defeat might just figure out a way to become even more dangerous, and given time to plan a counterattack, they could come back way worse than before. Defeat might drive them to the edges of desperation, and who knows what a desperate person is capable of. Dread is a complicated emotion to inspire, and since it requires a degree of fear of the unknown to power it, the more time an audience has to get to know a given character, the harder it becomes to keep them dread-inducing. But it's a very rewarding balance to strike. One of the most fun things a writer can manage to do is to give a character a reputation it seems completely completely impossible for them to ever live up to, and then find a way to let them live up to it anyway. I don't know if there's a secret formula for pulling it off every time, but I sure do like it when it works. So, yeah,